Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing the La La Land 45th anniversary restoration and release of John Barry's score for Moonraker. This is a Bond score that has been in just dire need of this sort of treatment, and this is a score that Bond fans have discussed for years. Not only did it need a complete restoration overhaul and a complete score release finally, as the original album was sorely lacking in terms of the selection of film cues and its edits. It was a fine listening experience for what it was, but it left a lot to be desired in terms of only giving a selection of the actual complete score, and also had a particular sound signature that was not the greatest or most detailed, as I'll get into later when I discuss the sound of the score. But it also has had rumors circulating that because it was recorded in France, that perhaps the original master tapes were lost or misplaced. And so there's been even fan attempts to re-record the score, which didn't come to fruition. But thankfully, that was only a rumor. And this new La La Land release is a complete restoration of the score from original tape materials and is, I think, the most stunning of these achievements the La La Land team has been able to do for the Bond scores to date, in terms of the just sheer amount of never before heard material, the incredible quality of the sound of the score, and the overall restoration and presentation is just it's a completely different experience compared to every time you may have listened to the score on the original soundtrack album program before this point. To talk a little bit about the score, I think once again John Barry shows his incredible talent for matching the tone, the spirit, and the heart of the film itself. Moonraker is another of the Bond films that's often derided for being of its time and focusing too much on gadgetry, and of course it's the Bond film that goes into outer space, and that typically is seen as going too far for most people from the sort of realistic core of what a James Bond film or story is. But I think that's doing a disservice to the film, because it is a lavish, larger-than-life experience with particular unique qualities that no other Bond film has. It was also, of course, the most successful James Bond film financially in terms of its original release in 1979, before you get into doing the inflation-adjusted numbers. And even when you do that, it is still one of the most successful James Bond films, which definitely speaks to how it was connecting with an audience of 1979 post-Star Wars and in the sort of science fiction boom in feature films. The film was, of course, produced in France, primarily due to the British tax laws and a good number of the crew, John Barry included, being tax exiles. So that's why the film has a particular style to really every aspect of it, from its cinematography to its editing to its pacing to its music, because the score was also recorded in France. So it had different technical production aspects and thus has a different sound quality than it would have had it been recorded in England or even in Los Angeles. So you always have to look at Moonraker with some of these concepts and ideas in mind. And it's also a far more serious film than people give it credit for. In fact, really, the first half of the film is quite grounded, and in spite of the finale having some obviously larger than life, less than realistic elements, most of the science fiction is relatively grounded enough, and interestingly has more links to 2001 than it does necessarily to Star Wars. It is also, of course, the film that has a completely silly humor and goofiness, and features the return of Jaws, except he becomes a heroic ally and even gets a girlfriend. So, it obviously has moments that are a bit too much, which the creative team recognized, which is why they did the course correction, describing it as bringing Bond back down to earth with For Your Eyes Only in 1981. But, all the double-taking pigeons aside, there is a unique entertainment factor of Moonraker, but also a serious somber quality that starts to emerge. And I think John Barry picks up on this in his score, because it is one of his most beautiful scores. It is very much string oriented. It is very much in his career style at this time, where he had shifted away from more of his famous 1960s trademark sound with the brass. And it's also building on what he did with his previous Bond score, The Man with the Golden Gun, which I like to describe as sort of the transitional John Barry Bond score. That was the first score that had more obvious string usage and string orientation in a lot of the cues. Well, here in Moonraker, we've now fully transitioned over to that style, and it's also carrying over maybe some of the themes and concepts he had been doing in his non-Bond scores, such as The Day of the Locust, and of course it's also got moments that basically sort of preface, I think, certain elements of his Somewhere in Time score. I actually think his Moonraker score is more romantic than his Somewhere in Time score, because for me, his Bond scores having that edge of cynicism and trying to reflect Bond as the ultimate outsider, and the music sort of becoming the internal monologue from the pages of Fleming, that always gives his Bond scores that unique edge, even over some of his non-Bond scores. And he would also do Disney's The Black Hole around this time period, which of course is another epic film with outer space settings being released in the post-Star Wars craze. So it's a great score to study for where John Barry was at this time, and also looking at his other scores in the 1970s, but also to see how he had fully transitioned his James Bond scoring style into his compositional style at that time. And it is remarkable how he picks up on Moonraker, the film, having this otherworldly quality, and it's what really sets up the transition to actually going into outer space for the ending of the film. It's something that starts very slowly, but from even the opening pre-title sequence, you can tell that there's a certain sort of almost eeriness. There's an ethereal quality to Barry's score that is what picks up on this idea. And so as the film progresses, the score progresses, and it's almost trying to prepare the audience for James Bond is going to actually go into outer space. We're not going to pull a fast one and jerk him out of the space capsule like we did in You Only Live Twice. We're actually going to go into outer space, which is actually kind of ironic because Moonraker is technically the sort of second remake of the You Only Live Twice plot. If you look at the actual structure of the films, The Spy Who Loved Me is basically sort of redoing the You Only Live Twice plot structure, and Moonraker is basically a bigger, more lavish version of Spy, except it's in outer space instead of underwater. But that's why Barry's score for Moonraker, I think, has this haunting quality to it. It's unique even among John Barry's Bond scores, because neither before or after would he have a James Bond score that had these elements in this way. There were some of his suspense cues that could have eerie or haunting moments or really dwell on a dramatic moment, but not a complete score like this that was also matching this different sort of flavor and this lavishness in the film production. So I think it being recorded in France also helped to add to this different sort of air, this different sort of quality that the actual sound has. So as a whole, the score is unique like the film, and I think it once again underlines John Barry's greatest talent possibly being his ability to get to the core of what the film was and translate its heart and spirit into musical form. There's also a sense that he was trying to craft a more epic score to suit such a bigger production, and with a movie that goes into outer space for the finale, you've got to have something big to match that. And I just think it's an absolute masterpiece of scoring. But I think there's been several problems over the years with being able to appreciate the score for how amazing it really is. One is that the film itself has a certain reputation, and it is very much a 1979 film. But it's also one that I think a lot of even Bond fans overlook in terms of all the money is on the screen, and it's an experience to be had. It's the type of movie nobody makes anymore, and you will likely never see again. It is maybe a bit too lavish and a bit too big of a production, but it's also unique, and it was entirely made in France, and that does rub off on the film experience. And yes, it has some moments of humor that are, a bit too much, but that contributes to the film's identity. And it's amazing that Barry was able to even pick up and highlight those. And so, in a sense, I think he's doing what he did on the score to The Man with the Golden Gun. But here you don't have the problem that Golden Gun had of having the extreme time crunch. So he did the Golden Gun score in about 3 weeks. And as great as I think that score is, it obviously was an issue to deal with. And he didn't have the time to finesse things or really develop certain things. Well, on Moonraker, they had, just tons of money to play with. So that wasn't really an issue. The issues are other things that crop up. This is one of the other problems that I think the score has had, and something Barry even talked about in vintage interviews, and that's how it's actually mixed in the film. There are a number of significant edits, and now that we have the beautiful new extended complete restoration, we can hear all these other pieces of music and uncut cues and things that were composed and intended for the film, but obviously dropped or cut or changed for different reasons as they seemingly no longer match the edit of the film. But Moonraker was also the first Bond film to be officially released in Dolby Stereo for the general 35mm release. So it was using a relatively new technology, and while I do think it's a great Dolby Stereo mix for 1979, and certainly better than most of the, shall we say, not so great attempts at working with new tech that even big budget films had trouble with doing, such as the infamous, really wimpy Dolby Stereo mix of Superman the movie, which is just a terrible Matrix stereo mix that is completely outdone by the 70mm version. Well, Moonraker, the score does seem like it is perhaps dialed back a bit in the mix here and there, and significant portions of the score edited. So Barry did express displeasure with how his score was actually mixed and spotted in the final release film. I do think it's actually better than what he sort of felt, but I can understand why he felt that way if you read the vintage interview quotes, and where he would specifically talk about this. And this particular issue has reared up again when the film has been remixed on home video a number of times. It's basically upmixing the original Dolby Stereo track, but MGM has a very spotty history of doing those. Then when the Ultimate Editions happened, there were new 5.1 remixes done for most of the films, and sometimes they would use other score sections from other sources, and so the remixes of the film have just sort of added to the problem. So when I watch the film, I still prefer listening to the original Dolby Stereo track in terms of what's on the old Letterbox Laserdisc release, and I do actually think the score sounds bigger on that. So basically the film mixed it and helped things. But then you come to what is the biggest problem for the score, and it's how it's been stuck in the original 1979 album program, which only had selected cues, and some of those were edited together for the listening experience. But it has a particular sound to it, which is not really what I think anybody wanted. And so for all these years, we've been stuck listening to just selections of the score, and the 1979 album master has a certain, some have described it as like it's got a great deal of reverb. I don't know if I would call it an echoey quality, but it's got a certain sound signature. It's almost like it's slightly veiled, and I think reverb's a good way to put it. It's like it's got this veiled quality with this sense of slight reverb or maybe a touch of boominess to it. But I've always gotten the impression that if you could actually hear what the master tape sounded like, that it wouldn't sound like that. And for whatever reason, the soundtrack was mixed this way in 1979, And that's been the version that's always been reissued. When they did the 2003 remaster series from Capitol on CD that Lucas Kendall oversaw the expanded ones, they were only able to do expansions of certain films, and Moonraker was one where they just did a new 2003 mastering of the original 1979 soundtrack. So you get the 2003 CD, and it's basically the 1979 LP now in CD form, slightly cleaned up. And it sounds good for what it is, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. So the idea and rumor that circulated that the original master tapes and scoring tapes for Moonraker had been lost or misplaced was not a very pleasant thought. And that's what led fans to even try doing a Kickstarter campaign to fund a re-recording of the score. But thankfully, that was unnecessary, as the original materials do survive and were able to be brought together and accessed for this new La La Land presentation. So here we have the new La La Land 45th anniversary release of Moonraker, which really wonderfully uses the original one-sheet artwork and again uses original logos and title fonts to create a custom and unique image for the La La Land soundtrack that is also beautifully respectful of the film's original promotional materials. So you've got the original one-sheet artwork, but then you've got the very stylized version of the Moonraker title that was used on some of the trailers and marketing campaign. There's even a nice matching sort of space-looking font for the musical credits, and we have the matching 007 limited edition that's in the jewel case of all these releases. We've got the matching spine with the 007 gun barrel logo, so all these match on the shelf, and then the rear with, of course, a lovely space background. And this, of course, gives the full and extensive contents of both discs, which just starts to indicate to any Bond fan who picks this up just how much material is on here and how much of it is actually previously unheard and unreleased material. The space motif carries on to the disc labels, which also have the same beautiful matching design. So all of these Bond score releases from La La Land, you can even display the discs side by side and they match beautifully. Disc 2 also matches, and then we have a beautiful, highly detailed printing on the art insert of the beautiful alternate artwork that was also used in the original poster campaign. The booklet is again on extremely high quality paper stock with a nice gloss finish and nice premium feeling thicker cardstock, so you definitely get that premium feeling from the booklet. The images are beautifully reproduced and all original production stills. The extensive essay is again by John Burlingame, which is building on the chapter on Moonraker in his essential The Music of James Bond, which is one of the essential reference books any Bond fan needs on their shelf. These booklets are just beautifully done, and this one even works in some concept artwork. So this covers background on the film, Barry's career at this point, what he was doing with this score in comparison to his previous Bond scores, and importantly some notes about the scoring session in France. Then it concludes with a passage about the basically the struggle to get to the title song, which went through a number of different permutations and of course had different lyrics and was originally designed for different artists. Again, this was produced by Neil S. Bulk, who had to do a lot of work, as this was such a long overdue project. It was mixed by Mike Matessino and mastered by Doug Schwartz, who's been doing incredible work on these releases. And then we have the credits at the end, and also rather nicely, if you pay attention, this last still on the last page is actually from one of the deleted sequences on board Drax's space station. Then we have a beautiful image on the rear of Ken Adams' amazing control room set. Now to talk about what you're getting on this release, the overall presentation and the sound quality. Let's just get the sound quality out of the way. Any version of the score you've ever heard on any past release, being the 1979 album program and the sound signature that has, that is completely gone. So if you've ever wished you could hear the music sounding better or without that particular sound to it, that is gone. That is not even a thing that is going to be on your mind when you're listening to this outside of, holy crap, this is better than I could have ever imagined. So the sound quality is the single greatest improvement of any of the La La Land James Bond score releases to this point compared to past releases. And then you turn to the actual score presentation. And this really starts to explain what Barry was trying to do with the score, trying to have more of an epic scope to it, and also talking about how he felt his score had been downplayed in the final film version because there is such a substantial amount of unused John Barry James Bond score material here that in and of itself is worth the entire purchase price, on top of the amazing sound quality and no longer having to deal with the constraints or sound deficiencies of the original 1979 album presentation. You will see over and over extended version, additional cues, all kinds of things that show just how much additional material is scattered throughout this whole release. And if that wasn't enough, we even have additional cues, including source music, instrumentals, and some of the non-score pieces, such as Drax playing his piano. We even have 2 takes of the bugle call from the start of the pheasant hunt sequence. I mean, it's just astonishing. Even the Gregorian chant from the monastery, which is actually doubling for an MI6 branch in South America, even that is here. I mean, it's just astounding. And so, as a Bond fan listening to this who knows the film back to front and practically has it memorized and quotes Moonraker in public every day without even thinking, yes, I do that, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. 14th century. The trouble is, there's never a 70-year-old around when you need one. This is like hearing the score for the first time, and then you get to all the extra pieces of music or certain cues that now have differences in them. I mean, even the opening pre-titles freefall music is completely different, and it also shows how it seems like the music in certain moments was composed for a different edit of the film, and that's why the music was further changed in the editing process. But most of all, when you get to the extra pieces of music or the pieces that are just simply not even used in the film, it makes this a treasure trove for John Barry and James Bond fans. And the biggest one that's going to jump out to everyone is here there is a completely unique piece of music that John Barry scored for the gondola chase, and specifically the gondola hovercraft, or the bondola, going across St. Mark's Square, and with all the humorous cutaways and, of course, the infamous double-taking pigeon. Getting to that point for the first time, it's one of those moments where it goes beyond your jaw hitting the floor. You're just sitting there going, oh my God, John Barry actually composed specific, unique music with the Bond theme and a sort of Italian flavor for even the gondola going across St. Mark's Square. This is astounding. Again, this is the most staggering of these La La Land releases so far. There is, I don't know the exact number of minutes of previously unreleased material, but if I had to guess and try to add up all the little pieces and all the cues, it's a substantial amount. I mean, even the disco end title version of Moonraker that Shirley Bassey does is slightly extended here on the main presentation. I mean, this is just, it's an astounding piece of really giving a score its proper presentation. Another point that really makes me absolutely ecstatic is that we no longer have to deal with the edits and combinations of tracks that the original soundtrack program had. And again, I can't stress how much of an impact it makes to be able to hear Barry's cues in their original form and without that sound signature of the original soundtrack presentation. So again, if that's ever bothered you, or you've ever wondered, what would the complete score sound like, and what would any of this music sound like if it didn't sound quite like this? This is what you've been waiting for. It's just I can't even believe this exists. That's how amazing this is. Then on disc 2, if that wasn't enough, we have the presentation of the original 1979 soundtrack album with the specific edits and everything recreated. So we have the original album preserved, which is truly important. And then, if that wasn't enough, we get to the bonus tracks on disc 2. And this is where we really go into holy mackerel, I can't believe this is in my hands territory. Because the title song went through different permutations. And originally, the idea was that Cubby Broccoli was going to get his friend Frank Sinatra to sing the title song for Moonraker. So John Barry started working on the song and had Paul Williams do lyrics for it and record demo versions. These have been sort of discussed, and some of the lyrics are discussed in Burlingame's book, but it was unknown if any of this stuff actually existed or in what form. And of course, Sinatra eventually passed on doing the film, and it went through different permutations until finally, more as a sort of a last minute approach, John Barry ran into Shirley Bassey and hit upon the idea of having her come back and do a third James Bond title song. And then Hal David, who had worked with Barry on Her Majesty's Secret Service, actually did the lyrics. And it's actually sort of drawing from the original version with the Paul Williams lyrics. Disc 2 has not one but two versions of the original Moonraker title song with Paul Williams actually doing the vocal. So this is the original version of the song. This is the song that was played for and submitted to Sinatra, who looked like he was actually going to do it at first. So this is the big what if in terms of the score, in terms of being able to actually hear the original lyrics, hear the original version, and then hear a completely alternate version. So you get two versions of the working demo version with a great Paul Williams performance of his original lyrics. And one can only imagine then what the Sinatra version would have been like. And he would have been obviously doing these same Paul Williams lyrics. It's the same melody as the final Moonraker song, so you can recognize it's the Moonraker title song music, but the lyrics are completely different. It's hitting on the same sort of theme, though, the sort of melancholy romance, and I guess of also being in outer space. So it fits the film, but it's completely different, and it's astounding that we can now finally hear this, and we get two different versions of it. I mean, I'm just flabbergasted that they were able to not only find this, but actually be able to include it, because I'm sure there was quite a bit of extra legal wrangling and red tape they had to go through with the different entities involved, and even finding this. I mean, it's just astounding. And if that wasn't enough, the bonus tracks also include an alternate instrumental of both the main title and the end title. So you get even more glimpses into John Barry's methodology and working on the main title song and the end title of Moonraker. So we essentially get an instrumental of the Disco Moonraker end title on top of everything else. This is the most stuffed, astounding score expansion for the Bond films that we've ever seen. And even among these amazing must-own La La Land releases, this release of Moonraker is the shining example of the most important one yet. It's just a staggering release that is... I still can't believe I'm holding it in my hands and we can listen to this. I cannot believe this exists. That's how astounding it is. I'm truly ecstatic we now have this release, because I think it will allow people to now finally be able to appreciate the full breadth of Barry's work on the film and really understand what he was going for and why he was really sort of describing it as more of an epic score and trying to give it a greater sense of sweep and a more majestic quality. And on top of that, I think it will also allow people to better appreciate the main title song, the Shirley Bassey song, which for my money is probably just about the most underrated song of the original Bond film series. If I had to choose my favorite of Bassey's three songs, it's actually Moonraker. I just have always loved how melancholy it is and how intimate it is. It's not as showy and as iconic as Goldfinger or Diamonds Are Forever are as songs. But Moonraker, in spite of being the one of the three that everybody thought didn't quite have that magic spark, and it was sort of hastily thrown together out of the working Paul Williams version at the very end of things, and substituting different artists until they hit upon getting Shirley Bassey to come back and do it. There's something about that that makes it more direct, and it doesn't have the showiness of her performances on the other two songs, and that has always made it hit in a different way for me. So I've always loved how melancholy and intimate it really is, and it sounds absolutely beautiful here. Another point I like to make with these releases when you come to them for the first time, especially discussing the sound quality, is just take the new restoration of the title song and the new transfer that's been done here and compare that to the presentation on the original soundtrack and also any of the James Bond theme compilations. Most of those are coming from different sources and typically not the original source. The difference in quality in the title song alone of all previous versions compared to this new presentation is such a night and day difference, and you're hearing so many little bits of instrumentation and noticing things that were either very low in the mix or, in some cases even really inaudible. You're hearing elements that you feel like you've never heard before, and that alone will indicate what you're in for the rest of the score and how that's going to improve over all past releases. But here on Moonraker, there's so much more material that we've never had on a physical release before to enjoy just for the score itself. And then all this material that wasn't even used in the film mix. It's just an absolute treasure. This is really a grail title for John Barry fans and James Bond fans. It's the type of release we've always dreamed about. If you've wondered what the complete score of Moonraker would be like and what the cues were like that were not used in the final film mix, well, you get it here, and it's the greatest present we've gotten outside of the other La La Land releases as James Bond fans. And the restoration and preservation work here puts the lackluster efforts that the actual films have gotten to shame. I mean, it is just a staggering, stellar piece of preservation work, and so far, it is the most important and the most astounding of these La La Land James Bond score releases. I strongly encourage anyone who's remotely interested in this release who hasn't gotten a copy already to go ahead and purchase one from La La Land's website. When they do these releases, there's an exclusivity window where for the first 90 days, I think it is, they're only sold on La La Land's website or the 007 store for other countries. But it's also best to purchase directly from the soundtrack label, so all your money is going directly to them. And when you purchase these releases, you're helping to fund and support future soundtrack restorations. They're also limited to only 5,000 copies, so get one sooner rather than later, as you will be kicking yourself for eternity if you don't get one of these before they're gone. And this really is the most important one they've done yet in terms of having such a breathtaking restoration of the score and the most amount of unused and unique material we've simply never had before. And it's the release with the greatest difference in fidelity and sound quality compared to the compromises of the original soundtrack album presentation. So my hat is not only off, but my deepest thanks goes to Neil Bulk and the entire team behind these La La Land releases. These are really the greatest James Bond physical media releases we've ever seen. Never before has there been such a degree of care and attention to detail to every single aspect of James Bond media, whether it be the scores or the films. And again, it really puts the corner cutting and issues that persist in the physical media releases and transfers of the films to shame, because this is as good as it gets. It's one of the only times I can talk about a James Bond physical media release for any of the original films and just be gushing and begging people to buy it, and I am in this case. If I haven't convinced you already to go purchase this from La La Land's site, I'm not doing my job. Not that this is really a job or one that I get paid for, but it's that level of just pure astonishment and absolute joy, and it makes you feel like a little kid again watching Moonraker for the 5 millionth time. That's the sort of feeling of elation you get. It's a dream disc. It is an absolute dream disc. It is the release of the score we've always dreamed about, and it seemed like it was something that was a dream. It was impossible. Well, the impossible has become possible with this restoration of the score. And the fact that I can now pick up a CD off my shelf and be able to listen to John Barry's rendition of Bernstein's The Magnificent Seven theme. I mean, that's just magic. That's what we collect soundtracks for, to be able to go back to pieces of film music that have stuck with us our entire lives and are just burned in our brain and play in our heads in our daily lives, and also be able to study and truly appreciate the work and the composition and the score itself, and be able to fully appreciate it in all its aspects. I mean, that's why we collect soundtracks. That's why soundtracks need to be properly preserved. This is a true preservation of a masterpiece score, and it is worth every single penny of your hard-earned money. And if you're at all interested, please do go and support the incredible efforts that La La Land is doing. They are being able to do further Bond scores basically on the levels of success and sales of each of the scores they've done so far. So not only are you able to get a copy, hopefully, before they're out of print, but every time you purchase one, that's essentially another vote of confidence and another sign that the powers that be at MGM, Eon, and Amazon can then say, "Oh, yes, you can continue. Let's choose another one to do," and then hopefully in the near future we can have a beautiful, complete run of restored CD releases of all the James Bond scores. So as always, I hope my babblings on the world of John Barry and James Bond scores and these incredible La La Land restorations and releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you have not gotten a copy of this reissue of Moonraker, stop whatever you're doing if you're a James Bond fan or a John Barry fan or you love Moonraker, because this is that essential. It is the most important of these La La Land releases to date, and you will get such a vast treasure of additional materials, additional pieces of music, and music that has never been released before, in addition to actually having the original Moonraker title song with the original Paul Williams lyrics and performance. I mean, it is a dream disc and one of the greatest James Bond physical media releases in history. So please go and get a copy if any of this sounds even remotely interesting, because it is that important and such a beautifully produced tribute to an incredible score. Please do go and support the incredible efforts of the entire team at La La Land Records by purchasing this directly from their website. I'll have a link in the description below, and also to the 007 store where it's being sold worldwide. And as always, keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching.